Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to Total War Warhammer, a game which I've been having the pleasure of playing for the last 2 weeks. I've put about 60 hours into the campaign. I've been playing through the Greenskins and I've been absolutely loving it. This video is going to let you everything that I've been able to find out through my first playthrough of the campaign about the Greenskins Army. We're going to look at all of the individual units, their strengths, their weaknesses, and so maybe you can pick up a few tips for when the game is released next week. And trust me, real-time strategy in a fantasy-based universe has never quite looked so damn beautiful. So firstly, let's take a look at the Goblin Great Shaman.
Great Shaman!
Yes, he does know his name. Fantastic for you, buddy. But not only does he know his name, he also knows a wealth of potential harmful spells to inflict upon the enemy. Also, the Goblin Great Shaman can ride on a wolf, which is very useful for controlling the range of engagement. The Goblin Great Shaman can use Vindictive Glare to do just regular damage to its opponents. However, my favorite Great Shaman ability is Curse of the Bad Moon, which inflicts a bit of damage, and it also puts a nasty curse on its opponents, and I just love the animation. This will continue to go through the enemy lines and can be very efficient indeed at plowing through opponents that have got themselves into too big of a blob. Alternatively, if magic isn't your thing and you like to get stuck into close quarters combat, you could pick a Goblin Big Boss.
My dagger's ready!
The Goblin Big Boss, if you choose to spend the points or level him up enough in the campaign, can ride into combat on the back of a spider, which does make him a lot faster and also gives him a charge bonus. However, the Goblin Big Boss is a duelist, so while he can handle himself against multiple weaker opponents, he is best used to try and target individual heroes on the enemy team. So if you can, try and use your Big Boss to fight the lords of the enemy team. Next, let's take a look at the meat of the Goblin Army, and that are the Goblin Spear Infantry. The Goblin Spear Infantry are shielded, they're quite resilient, and they're very, very good for holding down flanks. One of the best things about them is that there are a lot of them. They're expendable, and they are very cheap to maintain. And so when you have to sacrifice a few gits to protect some of your more important assets, then look no further than the Goblin Spear Infantry. There are also Night Goblins in the game, which instead of using spears, use swords. They've got awesome poison attacks, which slow down their opponents and also reduce the damage that they deal. Again, there's a lot of them, they're expendable, and they also count as Vanguard deployment. Vanguard deployment means that you don't have to locate your Night Goblins in the traditional starting area. What you can do is put them all the way close to the enemy if you're so inclined to be able to get stuck in immediately, or perhaps to be able to initiate an ambush. This can be very useful if you're fighting on a wooded map, where perhaps you can hide your units and lure your enemies into an ambush. There are also Night Goblin Fanatics which have spinning loons that they can release on the battlefield. However, while these can be absolutely devastating against multiple units, the spinning loons are rather unpredictable and low on ammunition. Let's just see if they're going to release one here. There he goes! How absolutely ridiculous. Look what happens when he hits the enemy lines. I don't think all of these guys are going to die. They should get back up. But it's very useful for causing just mayhem and destruction in the enemy lines. Goblins also have very useful archer units, which I really liked for my campaign playthrough. Not only are they cheap, there's a hell of a lot of them, and when you really need to take out lots of lightly armored opponents on the enemy team, or if you've just been able to get yourself an advantage to have a long-range engagement where you can force them to come at you, and you can pick off quite a few of them before they even get into close quarters combat. Personally, I prefer the Goblin Archers to the Orc Archers in my campaign playthrough because they're more accurate, but they're also a lot more vulnerable, so you do have to take that into account and try and protect them as much as you can. Also, the Night Goblin Archers do have poison attacks, which makes it very useful for trying to single out a target and trying to weaken them before they manage to get into combat. Now let's take a look at some of the orcs, and what better orc to start with than Grim Gore Ironhide. This is the protagonist of the Greenskins campaign, and he is a complete brute. Once you manage to get Grimgore Ironhide fully upgraded in the campaign, he can basically cut through entire units of your opponents, and he is truly an orc that lives up to his ego. Now let's take a look what is the bread and butter of at least a starting campaign of orcs, and those are the Orc Boys. These guys are so generic. They're fairly heavy armored. They do well against pretty much everything. They've also got shields, which makes them quite resilient. At the start of the campaign, these guys can absolutely dominate goblins and also lesser dwarves. But later on, you're going to want to try and move on to having bigger and harder orcs. Much like these guys, these are orc big uns. As we can see, they're just slightly bigger than a regular orc, and they're very, very good at dealing excessive amounts of damage to your opponents. They're bigger and harder as well, which means that they do take on large opponents very well. Were those orcs not cool enough for you? Well, how about these guys? These are the black orcs. They are super heavily armored. As you can see, they're completely clad out in all manner of protection, and they're also much better at piercing the armor of heavily armored opponents. But watch out, because these guys quite often struggle with having to kill multiple lightly armored opponents because they just do a little bit less damage than your big uns. But if armor isn't your thing and you're a bit more of a savage, then why not look towards the savage orcs, who forego all forms of armor protection to be able to put on war paint and have a very useful ability called Frenzy, which increases their damage when their leadership is high. And of course, in true orc style, there are also savage orc big uns, who, when you really just need to kill pretty much about everyone and don't worry about taking a little bit of damage, then these guys are probably the most brutal unit of any of the Greenskins army. And while I personally prefer to use goblin archers, the orcs do have their own arrow boys, as they like to call them, and there are even some savage orc arrow boys who are slightly faster than the regular arrow boys if you want to be able to keep them out of combat. Now you're looking at the awesomeness. That is Azog the Slaughterer, who rides into battle on the back of a wyvern named Skullmuncher. It really is models like this where you can see that Creative Assembly have put a tremendous amount of effort into Total War Warhammer, and it just adds to the immersion and the excitement. I have had so much fun flying into battle with Azog on his wyvern. As you can see, it is a pretty gruesome affair for the opponents. And the wyvern Skullmuncher even decides to get a little bit hungry sometimes. Just like that, some of the combat animations are pretty darn awesome. But Azog doesn't just slaughter his opponents in melee combat, he can also use a variety of spells to take them out. Such as the Purple Sun of Xerius. Yeah. When you need to suck them into the void. Look no further. How absolutely awesome is that? Or you can use Spirit Leech instead if you want to drain their souls. Next, we're going to be looking at the mounted infantry of the Greenskin armies. Firstly, the Goblin Wolf Riders. The Goblin Wolf Riders are super fast and they can simply run rings around most other units in the game, which can allow them to avoid more heavily armored dangerous opponents that will be able to easily beat them in melee combat and try and get to the enemy ranged units and hopefully their artillery. Alternatively, if you find that one of your flanks is falling, you can use them as a last-ditch attempt to try and rout the enemy by engaging them, hopefully in the flank or the rear. Some goblins choose to ride into battle on spiders rather than wolves. They're slightly slower, but these forest goblin spider riders do have poison attacks. And as you can imagine, when riding into battle on the back of a gigantic arachnid, you are very much more well protected. And they can be quite brutal when you manage to get a good charge off into your opponents. The Greenskins also have mounted ranged units in the form of Goblin Wolf Rider archers and also Goblin Spider archers. One of the most important things you can do with your ranged cavalry units are to put them into skirmish mode. And what this will mean is that when the enemy get close enough to engage them in melee combat, the AI will automatically take control of your ranged mounted units and keep them out of melee. Here we can see, without me telling them to do so, they keep firing and they keep running. This can basically mean that ranged mounted units can completely obliterate at least lightly armored non-mounted units that don't have ranged capability. Of course, it's not only goblins that can ride into combat on mounts. The orcs ride in on boars because I guess they're just a little too heavy to be able to ride into battle on a wolf, right? However, if those guys aren't quite big enough for you, just like with the non-mounted units, there are some orc boar boys, big uns, that are bigger and harder, apparently, making them better at fighting against larger opponents. And if these guys just aren't suicidal enough for you, then there are even savage orc boar boy biguns, that is quite a mouthful, who again forego all protection, don some war paint, and get stuck in to deal amplified damage. And when 2 boars are better than 1, sometimes the orcs like to fabricate a chariot. Now this can have absolutely devastating consequences for lightly armored melee opponents, as we are about to see. Oh dear. That's quite a few dead men. Next, we're getting on to the really exciting stuff. Take a look at the monstrous trolls that you can have in your Greenskin army. These guys have got terrible leadership, which means they quite often will run away from combat unless you engage with other units around them, or hopefully your leader. But they are armor piercing, which allows them to take on heavily armored opponents with ease. But again, don't do very well against a horde of lightly armored opponents that do surround them and slowly whittle down their health. However, the main aspect of the trolls is the fact that they get regeneration during the game. And so you better make sure that you finish off the unit altogether, otherwise it's going to come back at you just as tough as it was before. And of course, watching your trolls lumber into combat and go and beast some humans is always a hell of a lot of fun. And of course, when it's not enough to simply just club your opponents to death, we can see that the trolls occasionally puke on their opponents. Oh, that's pretty nasty. So if you thought trolls were monstrous enough, well, you haven't seen anything yet. Oh my god. This is the Arachnarok spider, which also has little savage goblins on top of it with bows and arrows. The Arachnarok spider unsurprisingly causes terror to those that have to fight it. Not only can it engage them at long range, it can trash entire units of opponents very quickly indeed. And there's something unbelievably satisfying about watching the Arachnarok spider go to town on multiple units of squishy opponents. But next we're going to take a look at my favorite unit in the entire Greenskins army, and that is the Giant. This thing is just so unbelievably cool. I absolutely love the model for it. For me, the most fun I've had so far in Total War Warhammer is when you manage to get a Giant into combat. He even eats his opponents. How absolutely ridiculous is that? It's absolutely awesome. Sometimes just sitting back and just watching him. Yep. Pound a stunty into other stunties and then throw him away. This really is what Total War Warhammer is all about for me. The fact that you're micromanaging these giant armies from above. We take a look at how many different units are fighting here, and yet each of the individual combats just feels so darn intricate. Next, let's take a look at the artillery options available to the Greenskins army, which are crude, brutal, but also effective. These are the rock lobbers. Rock lobbers are very slow to move and also incredibly vulnerable in melee combat. If an enemy mounted unit manages to get to them, well, they're pretty much defenseless and they're just going to die almost instantly. Absolutely love the combat animation for the rock lobbers. How cool does that look? Artillery are best suited protected at the rear of your army. And if you hold spacebar, you can see what their range is. Just look how gigantic the rock lobbers' range is here. As soon as the dwarves get into range, they are going to start to lose a lot of health. And one of the best things about rock lobbers is they are in fact armor piercing. And so that means that even the very stout and heavily armored dwarves are going to take incredible amounts of damage from our rock lobber spam. Artillery are just absolutely awesome at taking out large amounts of infantry that are moving at you, often very slowly like the dwarves are. And so if you can force the dwarves to have to advance at you with the greenskins, that is an easy way to take out an otherwise very resilient army. And as we can see here, even before the dwarves have managed to close distance to be able to get towards my army, they've already lost pretty much half the health over multiple units. And if we speed this up, we're going to see just how much damage our rock lobbers are able to do. There you go, that's pretty much 3 units of dwarves just completely routed. That's a third of his army before he's even managed to get into close quarters combat. However, if rock lobbers just aren't quite suicidal enough for you, then take a look at the Doom Diver Catapult. You really have to see this to believe it if you're not a big fan of the Warhammer franchise. Doom Diver Catapults involve a goblin with wings pulling back the slingshot, climbing on board with a giant spike on his head, and you guessed it, guess what's going to happen next? Geronimo! Here they come. Suicidal flying goblin bats. how absolutely ridiculous. And the best thing about these is, of course, the goblins are guided projectiles. And so that means they're actually very accurate. A lot more accurate than rock globbers. But unfortunately, the goblin projectiles are not armor piercing, and so they're vastly better suited to taking on lightly armored opponents like this. And if you want to take out heavily armored opponents, then you're best to use your rock globbers. One insanely fun thing about the Doom Diver Catapult, if you're so inclined, is that you can press your insert key to go into a first person mode. From here, what you can do is then launch your little goblin into the sky, and then you can bloomin' control where he goes, hopefully. Come on, just a bit further, Mr. Goblin. Bit further. Oh, what? I missed. Oh, let's see if we can give it another go. Okay, here we go. Whoa. Come on, Mr. Doom Diver. Yeah. There we go. Now, the practicality of this is a little bit awkward. I mean, you're not going to micromanage every single Doom Diver catapult that you find. But for sheer, like, just hilarity, this is just... There's something very satisfying about doing this. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed this look into the Greenskin Army. I've been playing them in the campaign for about 60 hours. I've been having an absolutely awesome time with it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like down below, so I know that if you guys want me to do this for all of the other different armies available in the game. And if you want to see even more Total War Warhammer action, then swing by on twitch.tv/QuickyBaby, because now the NDA is lifted, I can tell you absolutely everything that I have been wanting to for the last few weeks that I've been enjoying this game. And also stay tuned to this YouTube channel. I'm planning on putting some campaign playthroughs, maybe some highlights, if you guys of course like Total War Warhammer and you want to see more of it. And so as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.